This morning I talked about my own journey to the Orthodox faith, and in doing so presented somewhat of a critique, I suppose you might say, of some of the failures of Protestantism in an indirect manner, in the sense that I moved beyond that part of my life and came into the church. This afternoon I would like to concentrate on another aspect, and that is the Orthodox Church itself as it finds itself in America. Now, one of the things that struck me on becoming Orthodox, especially having read quite a bit about the historic church before coming into it, was the fact that I was rather surprised by certain things. And this morning I talked about how well I was welcomed in my particular community in Newburyport and the great pleasure of that experience. But this afternoon I would like to talk about a couple of things which surprised me, and I'm not talking about my local community. I'm talking about in the church in general as I've traveled and spoken with people. And that is that certain things that I have found to be the greatest treasures in the Orthodox Church, perhaps the treasure like the pearl buried in the field that Christ talked about, for which we sell everything we have, often don't seem to be very important to many people that I've talked to who are Orthodox, who were raised as Orthodox in the church. And frankly, this has somewhat surprised me. It also has concerned me, because the treasures within the Orthodox Church, which give it its uniqueness, have, I think, sometimes been ignored. I'm afraid that part of this problem comes in this country, as best I can understand it from doing a little historical reading on the subject, from the way in which Orthodoxy came into North America. You know, if you look at the Orthodox missionary effort, for instance, into the Slavic countries of Cyril and Methodius, the first Orthodox that came into that landmass of Asia were missionaries. They moved from Byzantium into Asia Minor and the Slavic countries deliberately to evangelize. They were Orthodox evangelists carrying on the apostolic mission. They did not go to Russia to become fur traders or to trade in wood pulp across to the Japanese paper mills, not that there were any then, but they came as missionaries, and behind them came the church. They invented the alphabet. They brought the whole Cyrillic alphabet into the Slavic countries so that people could have a Bible and a liturgy. If you look at the North American continent, with the exception of St. Herman of Alaska, who came across the Bering Strait, made that connection into Alaska as a missionary, as you would have found, say, with Cyril and Methodius 1,000 years before in Russia, with that exception, the Orthodox Church came to our country with our forefathers who were Orthodox in a way that was actually not typical of the way Christianity spread in the rest of the world. The way Christianity has spread in the rest of the world is through missionary activity that has been on purpose, like Cyril and Methodius or St. Herman, who went to places precisely because they wanted to share their faith. But in the American experiment, the way Orthodoxy came here was almost as an afterthought. It came as part of a general immigration from Europe, along with Germans and along with French and English people and others, Roman Catholics, Protestants, and so forth, who were coming to America not to be missionaries, but simply to pursue a better life for their families and their children. Now, there's nothing wrong, let me quickly say, from a Christian point of view, with wanting a better life for your family. So I'm not impugning any bad motives, and I'm not criticizing or judging, because we all work hard to have a better life for our families. 10 minutes ago, I was working hard to have a better life for my family, signing copies of my new novel, Portofino, downstairs. I earn my living as a writer. This is very important to me, and I hope there's nothing wrong with that. But having said that, the fact of the matter is, by accident, if you like, we, the Orthodox in modern America, were given a curiously atypical, not typical, Orthodox heritage. Because the Orthodox Church did not come here as missionaries, most Orthodox churches were almost an afterthought of Orthodox Christians. Communities would gather, and they would wake up in one way to another to the fact that they needed to baptize their children, to perform wedding ceremonies. They discovered they were in a Protestant culture that was totally foreign religiously to their background. And so somebody sent for a priest, and then eventually you send for a bishop, and something grows, and you have a diocese. Well, this has left us with a few curious anomalies, which I think that as Orthodox we have to look at honestly as we look to the future. One of them is the fact that our church is a divided church and an ethnic church. This isn't anybody's fault. It's just the way it came, just like French Roman Catholics and Italian Roman Catholics and Irish Roman Catholics all came to America. There were various Roman Catholic backgrounds. That too was atypical of history. You don't say, I'm an Irish Roman Catholic. A Roman Catholic is a Catholic, just as an Orthodox is an Orthodox, not a Greek or a Russian Orthodox. Orthodoxy is orthodoxy. But the ethnic background got very tangled with the beginning of the American Orthodox experience. And as a result of this, a curious situation grew up. And that is that really, from the beginning almost, there have been two Orthodox churches in America. The ethnic club, in which you get to heaven by eating 200 pounds a year of hummus and tahini or baklava, depending on your ethnic background. I'm being facetious, obviously, I'm exaggerating, but I'm trying to make a point. And the Orthodox Church, capital O, which is the universal church, one holy Catholic and apostolic church forever. Now, unfortunately, varying communities have expressed this in varying ways. The ethnicity of the American Orthodox Church has in some ways overwhelmed its ability to be a witness in two ways. One, it has given the idea to people in the general culture that the Orthodox Church sometimes is an inward-looking club, much more interested in making sure that daughters and sons marry Greeks or Russians or whatever the ethnic background is, or that the annual food festival is a success, than in preaching the gospel to what is essentially a pagan and Protestantized culture. It would be the equivalent if Cyril and Methodius had gone to the Slavic countries as merchants or fur traders or house painters or restaurant owners first, and then woke up to the fact that it would be nice to have church and be able to christen your son or baptize your daughter, and so they brought a priest afterward. But the fact of the matter is, the original immigration to America of Orthodoxy, except for St. Herman of Alaska, was not typical of the rest of Orthodox history, which came first, let's say Cyril and Methodius, as missionaries. Now, that's nothing bad, but that's the curious historic background. Now, as a result of this, therefore, there have been a couple things that I think that the Orthodox Church and we Orthodox Christians should look at in order to better understand, I think, the future. And one of them is the fact that in our lifetimes, and hopefully that of our children's, there will be a growth towards Orthodox unity in this country, so that in the North American continent, when you say Orthodox, they don't ask you what kind of Jew that is, but they know what you mean. And when you say Orthodox, they don't say Greek or Russian, they know Orthodox is Orthodox, the same orthodoxy that exists in the Phanar in Constantinople, the same orthodoxy that existed in Alexandria, the same orthodoxy that existed in Ethiopia, the same orthodoxy that exists in Russia, the same orthodoxy that fought for liberation against the Turks. It's one family. The same orthodoxy that in the Soviet Gulag stood against the KGB and NKVD and is still there today. One church. Now, there are various ways this could happen, but I foresee a way that would be best of all, and I'm not saying we can make it happen because God leads the church, but it would be the hope and prayer. And that is that as the Orthodox Church becomes the lifeboat for the refugees from failed Protestantism and modernism, the Orthodox Church literally outgrows its ethnic origin in the sense that the people who come in, by thousands, I believe, in the very near future, are going to be coming to the Orthodox Church because they love orthodoxy in the historic church and they want the sacraments and they want the Eucharist, not because of who they were born or what their last name is or where they come from. And in a sense, that will be the natural way that orthodoxy will finally find its true position in the North American continent. Not because of some meeting of bishops or a piece of paper or a book that's written, but naturally because there are so many Orthodox who begin to think of themselves as Orthodox first and even American second, let alone an ethnic background, that the church, as the church, will be the dominant and important force in their life and the motivation for what they do. And you begin to already see that in the sense that sometimes people who come into the church later in life and who have sought it out come in looking for the kernel, the truth, the pearl of great price there first. And while, for instance, in my case, they enjoy the benefit of being in a close, warm, loving community, in this case a Greek community in Newburyport, nevertheless, that's not why they came to the church. I didn't come into the church to be part only of a warm, loving community. I came in because I believed on that altar, in the hands of those priests, was the very body and blood of Jesus Christ, and I did not want to be kept from it, but wanted to come to it in the proper way. The second thing I would say is because of the way Orthodoxy came to this country, unfortunately, much of Orthodoxy in America has fit in all too well with the culture. And again, that's no indictment of Orthodoxy, because the whole Protestant culture has been corrupted by secularism and contributed to it, and certainly the Roman Catholic culture has. I saw an example of that one time when I was a speaker last year out at the Young People's Association. I was the speaker for the Orthodox Young People's Association out in California, and I was noticing how many more people in the evenings were going to the parties, not that there's anything wrong with parties, than were attending liturgy in the morning. Now, that wouldn't strike you as curious, except for the fact that this was the annual youth event for the Greek Orthodox Church, and that everybody was there as a church event. And yet Bishop Anthony from San Francisco, who was serving communion every morning at 8 o'clock in a room in the hotel there in Southern California, there would be, out of the 1,000 young people who were there, maybe 60 to 80 would come to the liturgy to be served by their bishop. But all 1,000 would be down in the hotel foyer, the bar area, from about 9 o'clock till 4 a.m. in the morning for the parties. 100 or so would come to a workshop given by a scholar or a priest or somebody who had expertise in an area of Orthodox life or spirituality, but all 1,000 would go on the bus tour to Beverly Hills to look at all the shops and so forth. And again, nothing is wrong in essence with enjoying the world we live in, but it was curious to me to be part of an event supposedly put on by a church for its young people, in which almost the churchly part was an afterthought. And any stranger to the situation would have come in and simply said, these people do not care about their religious belief as much as they care about just having a good time. This is a social event that could be going on any campus, any fraternity, any sorority, far more than it is a religious event. Now, in looking at something like that, in looking at the experience that many Orthodox parents have shared with me of watching their kids go away to college and either lose their faith or be enticed away from it entirely, in looking at some of these things, I think that we should also look at the environment in which we are Orthodox Christians today. And it seems to me that while the Orthodox Church in North America as elsewhere in the world has done a tremendous and commendable job in keeping the altar clean, the liturgy pure, the sacraments undefiled, the holy mysteries intact, it has perhaps, for various reasons, some of which we've mentioned, not done as good a job in passing on the Orthodox faith, one, to the next generation of Orthodox young people, and two, to people who come from the outside who would like to know about Orthodoxy if it was more visible. And those are the 2 points I'd like to address. One problem, I think, in looking back at the history, at the way most Americans, Protestant and Orthodox or Roman Catholic, came to America to improve their lives, is that in a sense, our forefathers voted with their feet to be part of the American system, perhaps without thinking through exactly what that was all about. Now, the fact of the matter is, we've just seen in the Soviet Union a remarkable occurrence. We've seen the collapse of materialistic Marxism, in spite of all the trendy, politically correct new left of the 60s and the 50s and the 40s before in America, and the 70s and even into the 80s that supported that system and said it was the rage of the future. It collapsed. And out of that rubble, what do we see coming? What is the one structure still standing? Well, symbolically, it's a little old lady standing there with an icon. And the whole rubble of the Soviet Empire falls after 70 years of dedicated, daily, thought-out persecution of Christianity. And what you see standing is not the economic system. Soviet Marxism is dead. Modernism is dead. What do you see standing? You see the church. And so, therefore, if Joe Stalin could come back, we could look him in the eye and say, you did your worst, you unleashed the dogs of hell against this church, but it's still here, and you're gone. What we see in the Soviet Union is an example of the fact that secularism that has as its base a humanistic, man-centered philosophy of social engineering failed compared to Orthodox Christianity, which had at its base a sense of mystery, transcendent values, and absolutes, that even in the hands of people who often were not particularly theologically trained, but because of their own piety and their own mysticism, it survived. So we can say Orthodoxy in the Soviet Union has survived the test of persecution in much the same way as Orthodoxy on islands like Crete or in other parts of the Aegean and in Greece survived the test of 400 years of Islamic persecution at the hands of the Turks. And it will again in the future. If that wave should sweep again over that part of the world, you can be sure that the truth will be passed on from one generation to another because it is the truth. But now I have a question. having looked at that historic phenomena in another place and another time, I have a question for us here. And that is, yes, indeed, the Orthodox Church survived persecution in the Soviet Union. But here's the question. Will the Orthodox Church in America, much of which came here originally to make a buck, will we be able to survive not persecution, but seduction? And my feeling is that persecution in some ways is much easier to stand up to than seduction, for the same reason that the carrot always works better than the stick. We, in America, judged by any Christian standard, are living in the world's whorehouse. That is the truth. This is the new Babylon. This is the end. This is Sodom. Judged by biblical standards, when the Ayatollah Khomeini said that America was the great Satan, he may have been wrong about a lot of things, and we may not like to hear it, but guess what? That's exactly what any Old Testament prophet or any hierarch of the church would say too. This is the country that murders a third of its unborn children a year, mainly for reasons of convenience. This is the country that dumps children in daycare and failed educational system and is turning out a whole generation of young barbarians while it pursues wealth and personal affluence. This is the country that has seen abortion, divorce become a normal situation that no one thinks about anymore, in which 50% of our homes are broken. This is in the country that creates more orphans of the divorce court than were ever made so by our wars. This is the nation that in its pursuit of materialism has created an entire dependent underclass that can neither escape poverty, neither work its way out of its impoverishment, or come to true faith because it is kept from that by our very structure. This country here in these United States has passed an invisible line, I believe, between a civil society and a barbarian culture. People don't want to hear that. Then again, people never want to hear bad news. Let me give you a definition of what I think a barbarian culture is from the point of view of Christianity. It's very simple. You can't define it exactly, but here's what I think. I believe that a culture in which it is harder to be virtuous than to be corrupt has passed a certain line. I believe that in a culture where it is harder to be virtuous than to be corrupted has passed a line. I have a son at Georgetown University. My daughter went to NYU, and I will tell you, having been familiar with their campuses, it is harder for my children and yours to live virtuously as Christians in the best universities of our country because of the way they are now run than it is for them to be virtuous. It is harder in this culture to be a good parent than to be a bad parent because there are 1,000 seductions that will tell you, no, your kids are not really your responsibility. Let the school do it. You deserve some personal emancipation. Go pursue your career, build the extra room, buy the BMW, make the down payment on the Mercedes. That's what's important. It is harder to be a good parent than to not be a good parent. The United States is a country in which the Orthodox Church is going to have to give as much mindful attention, I believe, to surviving as did the Orthodox Church in the Soviet Union. The problem is, in the Soviet Union, at least the NKVD and the KGB took the church seriously enough to put people up against the wall and shoot them or put them in the gulag. And in a weird, terrible, perverse way, that is actually a compliment because it says, we take your faith seriously enough to kill you for it. In much the same way that the Turks killed many a Greek Christian for their faith and gave them a choice. Our culture does something far more damning and difficult to resist. It says it really doesn't matter. You can believe anything you want. Sounds great. Sounds like freedom. Try handing your kids over to our secularized, aggressively anti-Christian educational establishment and see what happens. See how long they can believe anything they want. When they come into grade school, they will be given a value clarification and sex education class that will deliberately compete with your Christian ethics. Where you are teaching them about chastity and virtue, they will be handed condoms and told that homosexual sex is perfectly normal, and that chastity will be generally mocked within the educational culture from the earliest grades. Where you talk about history from the point of view of God directing it, they will be taught a version of history in which pure chance, with absolutely no ultimate purpose whatsoever, has directed every aspect of human civilization from its beginning, where life has evolved for no particular purpose, and where basically we look to government and politics for solutions to what the church used to think were moral problems of the heart and sin. Now it's just all social engineering projects. Our children live in a culture in which they're free to believe everything they want if they can survive 12 years of indoctrination in grade school and then a secularist, politically correct culture in our universities, which literally has room for every belief except one. And that is historic biblical Christianity. That is the one thing you cannot hold. That doesn't mean that you're going to be persecuted or thrown out, but that is the one thing that is not taught and given any credence, whether you're studying sociology, psychology, deconstructionist literary criticism, the feminist literary criticism that's come out of that, which is built essentially on a Marxist framework of deconstructing the original meaning in the text. That is what you will be getting in your sociology and anthropology class. And that is what we are going to see increasingly mandated in our school system. The fact of the matter is that Orthodox Christians in this country of this generation, however naive their forefathers may have been in coming to our culture, in thinking that this was just a nice free country where you were free to make your pile, send a little back to the old country, bring over your cousin from Crete or wherever it was, build a nicer house and put an addition, has been sadly deluded if they think that that lack of resistance to the civil culture around us is going to be enough to train their children to resist a society that has at its core only one absolute today. And that is that there are no absolutes. Our culture believes in one overriding philosophical principle, and that is that there are no overriding philosophical principles. Do your own thing is the motto of today's culture, not try to follow the mandate of either scripture, holy tradition, or your priest. Confession has been abandoned and replaced by psychology. Confession tells you that you are a sinner and need to change your behavior. Psychology helps you live with your sin, change nothing, but get rid of your guilt, not because you've changed your behavior, but because it teaches you a few tricks to feel better about yourself no matter what you're doing. Our culture teaches a high sense of self-esteem for no reason. We tell our young people, we don't care if you can read or write or you've stabbed somebody. Of course, I'm exaggerating. No one says it like that, but this is the implication. You should still feel good about yourself. And if you don't, we'll do whatever it takes. We'll lower test scores. We'll falsify history. We will deflate our educational system to accommodate failure. We will basically rearrange the universe for you to make you feel better. We even have legislated biology to make you feel better. No biologist, geneticist has any question about when life begins. Only in the area of political biology that is meant to make people feel better who are using casual abortion as birth control do we pretend we don't know that when the 46 units of the chromosomes come together that you have the full genetic capacity of any human being. Only in the area of political fiction do we pretend that you can't know these things. And only in the area of political fiction do we pretend that divorced marriages produce happier children or that single-parent households produce better results. We fly in the face of reality in order to simply make ourselves feel better about the fact that we are a fundamentally pagan and immoral nation. Touch it where you want, and I know this is strong, but I believe this to be true. Touch it where you want, measured by any standard remotely connected to the historic church. This is a culture that is rotten to its core. When you get to the bottom, you will find nothing but a wormy apple. And if you think it's that way now, just wait for 5 or 10 years. There is a freight train, a juggernaut coming that will make your head spin. If you look at how quickly things have moved just in the last 15 or 20 years in the way of a devolution of social standards in the area of family, sexuality, responsibility, honesty, thrift, responsibility for people, wait for the future. The handwriting is on the wall. I'll tell you where you can find it. You can find it in every old folks' home in which you have abandoned and elderly people who are sacrificed to the great American nightmare. You will find it in the dumpster of every abortion clinic, behind every Planned Parenthood clinic in America, where you have babies ranging from 4-week-old fetuses up to babies that would have been born 2 weeks later, fully formed, alive and kicking, who have been sacrificed to the great American nightmare. You will find it in our laboratories today, as our president has just signed an executive order opening up unlimited, unqualified, unchecked experimentation on babies and the transplant, let's say, of fetal tissue, which of course has to be kept alive after it's aborted in order to be transplanted. And those little live Aborted babies, of course, have no rights at all because they don't exist. They don't exist in the same way that the black men didn't exist a few years ago on the plantation. They are simply slaves of science and slaves to the idea that personal self-fulfillment and realization at any price should have no bounds. And so you have an aborted baby in an American lab, now kept alive for a few hours until its brain cells can be taken and implanted in an operation, as if you had been watching Nova 2 weeks ago. This is common knowledge you would have seen. Interestingly enough, though, while the Nova producers will show you the transplant, they won't show you the brain cells being taken out of a living little fetus that then is left to die on a cold slab and put in the incinerator. That's America. That's today. That's reality. That's where we are. That is our history. Whether you like it or not, that's where we live. So what is the place and the role of the light and the salt of the earth, which is the Orthodox, Holy Catholic, one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church in this environment? Well, first of all, let's take some courage for something. This is not a new phenomenon for the church. If you look at where the Orthodox was church was born out of ancient Rome and the pagan cultures, actually we've returned to our roots. This is where the church came from. The church was born in an era of child sacrifice. The church was born in an era in which a wife, a daughter, had no rights. That if a father wanted to have a daughter killed because he had wanted a son and leave her at the gate, he could do it. Women were chattel property in the whole pagan world before the church came along. Men could divorce women. Women could not divorce men for infidelity until Ignatius and Irenaeus and Basil and the others began to write and change those laws and bring some equality. That's what you don't hear today, but that is the history. That is the case. Compare Western civilization with its background of women's rights to, say, even modern-day India, which, according to the BBC, only 4 weeks ago, 16,000 brides were killed in 1989 alone because they brought insufficient dowries, and the law looked the other way. That is the norm. That is typical of the world's history when you have paganism at your heart. And we are simply coming back to a pagan era in which we have parents going in for amniotic tests of their unborn children, the growth industry being for sex selection. And the great irony of all is, of course, that 9 times out of 10, the babies aborted are little girls because people want sons. And so we come full circle and we're back to Rome, literally in the sense of a barbaric culture on a search and destroy mission, not only for its unwanted children who have fetal defects, but even for daughters now when you wanted a boy. So the first thing to note is this is not a new situation. The church was born out of this type of pagan environment. We have returned to it. The second thing to note is that just as the church stood against barbarism and persecution and tyranny in the Soviet Union through the guidance of the Holy Spirit, I believe, so we here can stand against the seduction of being the living bride of Christ in the middle of the great whorehouse of the world, which is the North American continent as we now see it. And the fact of the matter is that the rest of the world is quickly beginning to see us this way too. And that when you look, for instance, at Islamic cultures, which have traditionally been the enemies of Christendom, as you well know, even the Islamic cultures are now beginning to slam their doors in the face of this unbridled pursuit of personal peace, affluence, happiness at any price with no moral limits. And for the same reason that many a Christian parent does not want MTV and the networks and 100 cable stations pouring like diarrhea, excuse the expression, into your living room, many foreign cultures are looking at what we are now exporting from the great Sodom and saying, we don't want this either. The result is terrible. We, too, are afraid of losing our children to this incredible mixture of greed and entertainment at any price. And so we're living in a curious time in history. We're going to be looking at some strange allies before it's all done in the stand for any kind of moral integrity. I feel that the mission of the Orthodox Church in the midst of this mess is a number of things. The first and most important is to do nothing at all. That may sound very curious, but the last thing we want is some clever clergy laity group getting together to make the church more efficient, streamlined, and modern. God forbid. The last thing the Orthodox Church wants to do is update itself and join the headlong rush like the Gadarene swine over the precipice of modern efficiency and learning how to get on with the 20th century. If you know how to get on with modernism, it's hard to be a Christian, in the same way that if you're too friendly with the KGB in the Soviet Union, you're not going to bury that icon in your basement. And so the first thing I think the Orthodox Church should do in America is nothing. What I think it should concentrate on is what the church has always concentrated on, and where the true answer is, which is not politics, and is not a social program, and is not the Democratic or the Republican Party. Not that politics doesn't serve its place, but in the change of the content of each of our individual characters to become more like Christ through a personal journey, a disciplined spiritual journey towards God, that we ourselves can become like Him. That is the mission of the church. And to come back to what I said a few moments ago about certain things that kind of shocked me, if you like, in coming into the Orthodox Church, it's in this very area. One of the great gifts that I found as a Protestant was that I was no longer on my own. My confessions were no longer muttered into my pillow. I had someone to answer to, my priest and spiritual father, as millions of Christians before me had done. It struck me as incredible to find that there were many Orthodox in the North American continent, this great seducer of men and women's souls, who, for instance, were no longer going to regular confession, who no longer had a spiritual father to who they were accountable, when I looked at my own life at what a great gift this was. And I'll just give you a personal example. I have a bad temper. That's something that I like to think I inherited, but I chose it a lot of the time too. It's an easy way out of a situation to just yell at somebody. Now, the fact of the matter is, this was an area of my life that I'd been working on for quite some time in terms of spiritual growth. And all the counseling in the world and reading a book or two and making your mind up a New Year's resolution, telling it to Jesus, confessing and so forth and so on, all sounded good. The fact of the matter is, it didn't work. Why? It didn't work for the same reason that it doesn't work when you simply tell your children to do something and never check up on it. Once in a while, when you leave your kids, it's good to sneak back down the drive and see if they're doing what you told them to. And if there aren't, there's hell to pay. Why? Because even though you trust and you love your children and generally they're well behaved, you know perfectly well there has to be a bottom line. Well, the fact of the matter is, there's got to be a bottom line for 40-year-old women and 40-year-old men too. And the bottom line in the historic church is not your feelings. It's not doing your own thing. It's being accountable to a spiritual father in the context of an orderly, disciplined church in which that person has the power to tell you, look, you keep coming to me with this same problem, and you're not making any improvement in it. And what you're doing is not psychologically wrong, quote unquote. It is a sin. And therefore, you are not properly preparing to come to the communion and the chalice. And if you don't shape up, which has always been the means of discipline in the church, you are going to be kept from the table of the Lord for a certain amount of time until you learn to pray and work and deal with this thing. Not be perfect, but seek growth. Now, the amazing thing to me is our culture knows the need for this. That's why psychiatric help, clinics, psychological counseling, 12-step programs, and group therapy are a growth industry. That's why there are psychiatrists standing on every street corner in this country, basically, handing out counseling to people, because people long for accountability. And what's so curious to find in the Orthodox modern American situation is that here, this great gift, which is the real thing, and it's called confession, not to a counselor, but to your priest or another spiritual father of your choosing, has more or less been abandoned. Not by everyone, and not in theory, but in practice. So as a Protestant coming into Orthodoxy, one of the great things was, and one of the reasons that I saw some real change or the ability within, say, my own family to have some movement, and one of the great gifts that my wife found, and my daughter, and my two sons, and that we compared notes about, that was uppermost in our mind, that we probably talked about more than any other single aspect in terms of the way it changed our lives, was that here, finally, we were not alone just with our pillow and our conscience, but there was someone to guide us, to help us to grow spiritually. And then when I came into the Orthodox Church, I started finding that there were Orthodox Christians who either were unacquainted with their heritage and did not know that this was part of the Orthodox life and that they were not taking communion properly had they not been regularly confessing and growing in this area, or really didn't think it had anything to do with them, as if somehow the church in North America has its own rules. How typically Protestant in America that and American that idea is. Oh, well, we do things differently here than in the old country. Well, that may be so for a food festival, but it better not be in an area that goes back to the very beginning of the church, where in the book of John, Christ tells the disciples standing there at his ascension that they are to hear confessions, and what they bind on earth is bound in heaven, and what is loosed on earth is loosed in heaven, and it's one of the first commandments of Christ to his new church. That doesn't change. And the strange thing to me is not that this is some rule or regulation of confession that people have to do, but that here is the very thing the whole world is longing for. Accountability and structure. Here is the thing that as a Protestant I found to be one of the greatest sacramental gifts of the church. And yet, you look at the modern Orthodox Church, and there are many people who have not taken advantage of this thing. And that's not sinful as much as it is simply tragic and short-sighted, I believe. So in looking at our culture around us and in looking at a consensus in terms of sending our children out into it, one thing becomes apparent to me. And that is, it's not going to be so much what we say with our mouth, but what we do. And that every Bible study in the world and platitude and little pious saying, and if you're like the Protestants, a little piece of plastic muck stuck to your refrigerator with a Bible verse on it, is going to do no good if we ourselves, no good with our children and new generations or converts who are looking to you, or a lost secular culture that's looking to you, unless with our lives and our feet we are voting with our consciousness in what we do. So if we talk to our children about moral accountability, and we expect them to go to Georgetown and Vassar and Berkeley and act that way, and yet we ourselves are not even accountable to our priest, and not even accountable to the church in the most basic area of moral accountability, which is confession, how on earth do we expect any kind of result out there? I'm not saying there can't be one. By the grace of God, you can always have one, but we certainly shouldn't expect it. And so for me, the program, quote unquote, of the Orthodox Church in North America is not some modern, slick, well-packaged, evangelistic, wow, go out and get them, spend $100 million, update the thing, a committee to look at this issue and a committee to look at that. It's much more basic than that because we have to be able to crawl before we can walk. It has to do with personal spiritual accountability first. And to me, that starts with confession, in the same way that the road towards Christ starts with repentance. The road towards the Eucharistic life, the sacramentally based life, the life in which we see the sacred in everything and the icon of Christ in everyone, including in all of these icons, must start with our own repentance. And in the Orthodox Church, that's not some free-for-all muttered prayer into your pillow. That is being accountable and, yes, even embarrassed by, just like my kids are embarrassed when I catch them doing things sometimes. Yes, even willing to be embarrassed and humble and self-effacing in a world which knows no such things, in order that we can truly begin to grow spiritually. And the Orthodox Church, in its mercy, understands that not all priests get on as well with all parishioners, and so it gives us the freedom to have a spiritual father to whom we're accountable, who may not be our priest, with our priest's blessing nevertheless. But we can't hop around like the Protestants and try this and try that and try the other thing. Orthodox Christianity does not teach that it's supposed to be fun, quote unquote. Protestantism presents itself as if it's an adjunct to the Epcot Center in Disneyland. And if you're not enjoying it all the time, you get off the boat and you go down the road there. Orthodoxy is the other way around. Who are our heroes? Walt Disney and Betty Friedan? No. St. Mary of Egypt, a repentant whore. That's who our hero is. Look at the difference at the people we hold up as the holy mothers and holy fathers of the church, and you will see the difference in the heroes of Orthodoxy right there. That really is all you would need to study if you would understand that. And the heroes we have in 20th century America, which are all fist-in-your-face go-getters. And therefore, for us, I think, and it cannot be stressed enough, that the program for Orthodoxy in North America is, first of all, repentance, not on the level of some mass movement, but an individual accountability to a spiritual father. And I would just say personally and humbly, from my point of view, as a recent convert to Orthodoxy, that I can hardly imagine that what I've found is the greatest gift as someone from the desert out there and coming into the church would be something that could be that ignored. The next area that I think we have to look at with great honesty is in the area of teaching our children and teaching people outside of the church. And again, our actions often speak louder than our words. What do I mean by that? I don't think there's anything wrong with food festivals. I don't think there's anything wrong with ethnic clubs. I don't think there's anything wrong with a HEPA or some other organization using church facilities. You may all disagree with that, but I'll tell you what I do think is wrong. In my experience of talking to so many Orthodox Christians who asked me about their own families vis-a-vis the experience I've had, and that is to raise people in an Orthodox community in which they do not get the idea that all these other things are very small compared to the one big thing, and that is to be a real Orthodox Christian. And that our energies and our efforts have got to shout loudly, much more than our words do, that we put our efforts into the Orthodox faith. And if we don't know what we believe, and we're not willing to pass it on to our families and those around us, let me assure you of something. As someone who works in the movie industry, just got finished with a little ABC movie there for the network, writes books, does all these things, spends most of his life, quote unquote, in a really hard-bitten secular environment, and who has a couple kids who have gone through the American college system and are in it to boot. and done a little study. Let me tell you something I've observed. We may not know what we believe, but don't fool yourselves into thinking the world doesn't. You may not know or want to articulate your faith to your child, but I'll tell you something. That kid's sociology professor will. And what they'll be getting in 4 years of college that you'll be paying for by mortgaging your house, good trade, will be an object lesson in both word and deed that stands against everything in the area of a sacramental tradition you say you believe. The fact of the matter is, as you flip channels on TV, as you go off and audit a course down here at any of your local colleges in Boston, and I don't mean every single place, as you throw open your New York Times or your Boston Globe to the editorial page, most of the time what you are getting is an avalanche of information, an avalanche of proselytizing, if you like, that is diametrically opposed to what you stand for as an Orthodox Christian, if you consider even for one moment what our inheritance is. What can I give as an example out of Orthodox history? It would be as if on a Greek island somewhere, Corfu, let's say, through the 400 years of the Islamic occupation, the Turks, you had one generation after another of Christian mothers